The memory of peace was a fragile, lingering ghost in Elara's mind. It smelled of cold mountain air and the crisp scent of the ancient pines guarding her family's territory. It was the warmth of the great hearth in the main lodge and the comforting aroma of her mother's herbs. That memory was a precious, brittle thing, and on this night, it shattered forever. The first warning was not a sound, but a scent carried on the storm-washed wind, a wrongness that prickled the fur along her spine. It was the smell of strange wolves, of aggression and intent, too close, far too close to their heart. Then the howls erupted, not the familiar songs of her pack, but brutal, sharp cries that sliced through the thunder's rumble. The Night Fang territory exploded into chaos. Shadows detached themselves from the forest, becoming solid, snarling forms. Elara shifted in a flash of pain and light, her gray wolf emerging ready for a fight she instantly knew was futile. They were everywhere. Her world narrowed to the frantic rhythm of lunge and dodge, the hot spray of blood on her muzzle, the snapping of jaws far too close to her throat. She fought with the desperate fury of a creature who knows it is defending its very existence. Around her, the familiar faces of her packmates, the wolves she had grown up with, were falling. Their agonized yelps were swallowed by the storm and the cacophony of battle. The air grew thick with the smells of iron and smoke as torches were thrown onto lodges, their hungry flames casting monstrous, dancing shadows against the trees, through the haze of combat. Her gaze, desperate and terrified, found its anchor. There, in the clearing at the center of the village, stood her parents. Her father, Alistair, was a massive storm-gray wolf, his roar a challenge that once could silence an entire forest. Beside him, her mother, Lyra, moved with a lethal grace, her white fur a stark beacon in the darkness. They were the heart of the pack, and they were fighting back to back, a whirlwind of fang and claw against the encroaching tide. For a single, heart-stopping moment, Elara felt a surge of wild, foolish hope. If they could just hold, if they could just reach them, perhaps they could turn this tide. That hope curdled into pure dread as a new presence entered the fray. He moved through the battle with an unnerving, deliberate calm. Kael, the alpha of the Bloodmoon Pack. His wolf form was a creature of nightmare, a beast of solid shadow and terrifying size, larger and more powerful than any other on the field. He did not bother with the common warriors. His path was a straight, unstoppable line, his focus absolute, his destination horrifyingly clear. He was heading directly for her parents. Elara tried to scream, to howl a warning, but a heavy weight slammed into her side, powerful jaws closing on her flank. Pinned and fighting for her own breath, she was forced to become a spectator to her own annihilation. What happened next was not a battle. It was a brutal, efficient dismantling. Her father, already wounded from defending the perimeter, was no match for Kael's fresh, concentrated power. Kael moved with a chilling economy of motion, evading Alistair's powerful lunge and retaliating with a bite to his foreleg. The sound of breaking bone was a sickening crack that echoed louder than any thunderclap. Her mother lunged to intervene, a snarl of pure maternal fury on her lips, but one of Kael's betas intercepted her, his attack swift and final. Elara saw the light in her father's brave eyes extinguish as his great body collapsed into the mud. She saw her mother's white form still, a final, shuddering breath leaving her lungs. The world stopped. The sounds of battle faded into a dull, roaring silence in her ears. There was only the vision of their still bodies and the black wolf standing triumphantly over them, his dark muzzle glistening with their blood. A sound tore from Elara's throat then, a howl that was not a howl, but a raw physical manifestation of grief. It was a sound so full of utter agony and loss that it seemed to choke the very air. The fight left her body completely. Her muscles went limp. The wolf, holding her, released its grip, cowed by the sheer despair of the sound. She shifted back to her human form, her body crumpling to the rain-soaked, bloodied earth. Sobs racked her frame, her tears cutting clean trails through the grime and ash on her cheeks. She did not look up as the heavy, purposeful footsteps approached, squelching in the mud. She had nothing left. He stood over her, a towering figure, now returned to his human form. His chest was bare and marked with the evidence of the night's violence, yet he carried himself with an unshakable authority. The rain slicked his dark hair and ran in rivulets down his skin. He did not speak immediately, his silence more terrifying than any victory cry. When his voice finally came, it was a low, resonant rumble that held no trace of triumph, only a grim, unyielding finality. He stated the plain truth of her new reality. The line of grafing ends tonight. Elara found the last dregs of her spirit, lifting her head to spit her defiance into the mud at his feet, her voice a broken, raw thing. Then kill me and be done with it, you monster. He crouched down, his movement fluid and powerful, bringing his dark, intense eyes level with hers. They were not the eyes of a beast lost to bloodlust. They were chillingly clear, calculating, and held a depth of purpose she could not fathom. His response sealed her fate, his words more binding than any chain. Death is too simple an end for the last daughter of my greatest enemy. Before she could process his meaning, his hand shot out, his grip closing around her arm like a manacle of heated iron. He hauled her effortlessly to her feet. As she struggled weakly against his immovable strength, he threw her over his shoulder. Her screams and her futile fists pounding against his back were as insignificant as the rain. He carried her away, stepping over the bodies of her family, walking past the burning skeleton of her home, and into the deep, waiting darkness of the trees, leaving the ghosts of her old life to fade in the smoldering ruins behind them. The first thing that registered was the scent. It was not the clean, cold smell of the mountain air she had known all her life, nor the comforting aroma of wood smoke and pine needles. This was a different atmosphere entirely, one that invaded her senses even before she opened her eyes. It was the smell of old leather and polished wood, of cedar and cold stone. Underlying it all was a potent, masculine fragrance, a wild and earthy aroma that was entirely and unmistakably his. It was the scent of the man who had murdered her parents. It was the scent of her captor. It clung to the heavy fur she lay upon. It was woven into the very air she was forced to breathe. Elara opened her eyes to a dim, vast chamber. A single, high window allowed a sliver of pale moonlight to cut across the room, illuminating dancing dust motes. The space was sparsely furnished, yet spoke of immense power. The bed was large and framed in dark, heavy timber. A massive fireplace, currently cold and dark, dominated one wall. Trophies and weapons were mounted with precision, and shelves held a collection of books and artifacts that seemed at odds with the image of the brutal killer she knew. This was not a cell. It was a sanctum. It was his room. He had placed her in his own private quarters, a move so confounding it felt like a deeper violation than a dungeon would have been. This gilded cage was designed to disorient, to remind her with every breath that she was now entirely surrounded by him. Days bled into a meaningless procession of silent hours. Her existence became a performance of defiance staged for an audience of one, though that one was often absent. She would pace the length of the room, a caged animal testing the boundaries of its enclosure. The heavy oak door was always locked from the outside. She would sometimes press her ear against the cold, solid wood, listening to the muted sounds of the pack going about their lives, a world from which she was utterly excluded. Her hatred for Kael was a fire she stoked constantly in her mind, the memory of her parents' final moments the only fuel that kept the paralyzing grief at bay. She rehearsed the things she would scream at him, the curses she would spit, the promises of vengeance she would whisper. Yet when he did appear, her carefully constructed fury often crumbled under the weight of his unnerving calm. He would enter without a sound, carrying a tray of food or a stack of books, his presence immediately dominating the spacious room. He would place the items on a heavy table, his eyes finding her wherever she was, that same intense, unreadable gaze pinning her in place. He never spoke unless she spoke first, and his replies were often brief, factual, devoid of the gloating cruelty she expected. This quiet, watchful attention was more terrifying than any threat. It made her feel like a specimen under glass, her every emotion noted and catalogued. He began to bring her things, small offerings that confused her more than any outright hostility. One day it was a stack of books, their leather bindings familiar and achingly so. She recognized them as histories and legends from her own family's library, looted from the ashes of her home. The act felt like a deliberate twist of the knife, a reminder of all he had destroyed, yet the intention behind it was unclear. Was it mockery? Or was it, impossibly, a gesture of something else? Another time, he left a set of clean, finely made clothes on the foot of the bed, garments that were simple but of excellent quality, clearly made for her. He provided for her physical comfort with a detached, efficient care, as if she were a valuable but troublesome pet that required maintenance. This inconsistent treatment frayed her nerves. The solid ground of her hatred was developing treacherous cracks. How could she sustain her rage against a monster who acted, at times, less like a jailer and more like a host? The question was a poison in her mind, weakening her resolve. She was isolated, with nothing but her grief and the slowly growing, terrifying realization that the man who had shattered her world was an enigma she could not begin to solve, and that her survival might depend on understanding the rules of a game she never agreed to play. The silence in the chamber had become a tangible presence, a third occupant that fed on Elara's grief and festering confusion. It was a heavy, thick thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire Kael had lit in the great hearth each evening, a concession to the growing chill that did nothing to warm the cold stone of her heart. She sat curled in a high-backed chair, watching the flames dance, her body rigid with the effort of containing the storm inside her. The opulence of her prison had become a mockery, the fine furs a suffocating weight, the scent of him in the air a constant, maddening reminder of her powerlessness. The memory of her parents' final moments played behind her eyes on an endless, tortuous loop, but the edges of the images were beginning to blur. Frayed by Kael's unsettling calm and the insidious questions his behavior provoked, tonight, the silence felt different. It was a pressure building in the room, straining against the stone walls. Kael was seated at his desk, a ledger open before him, his presence a dark and focused energy that seemed to pull all the light in the room toward him. Elara could bear it no longer. The coiled spring of her anguish finally snapped. She launched herself from the chair, her movement sharp and violent. In the quiet room, why? The word was a raw, torn thing, ripped from the depths of her being. She stood before his desk, her small fists clenched at her sides, her entire body trembling. Why am I here? Why keep me alive in this gilded tomb? Was watching my parents die not enough for you? Do you need to savor your victory by watching me slowly lose my mind? Kael's head lifted slowly. His dark eyes met hers, and she saw no anger in them, no irritation at her outburst. There was only that same unnerving depth, a weariness that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. He closed the ledger with a deliberate, soft thud. He did not stand, but his stillness commanded the space between them more effectively than any aggressive movement could. You believe this was a victory to be savored. His voice was low, a rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. You believe I am a monster reveling in his spoils. What else could you be? She spat, hot tears of frustration welling in her eyes. You slaughtered them. You destroyed everything I loved. So, kill me and be done with it. Or is your cruelty so refined that my suffering is a finer prize than my death? He rose then, not with haste, but with a controlled, powerful motion that made her take an involuntary step back. He moved around the desk, stopping a few feet from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the faint scar that cut through his brow. I did not start this war, Elara. I ended it. His gaze was unflinching, holding hers captive. The story you carry in your heart, the noble history of the Greyfang line, is a lie woven by a coward to hide his shame. Your father, Alistair, did not defeat my father in a fair challenge for territory. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air between them. He ambushed him. He and his most trusted warriors intercepted my father when he was traveling under a banner of truce to discuss a lasting peace. They murdered him in cold blood, and when my mother threw herself over his body, begging for their lives, your father gave the order for her throat to be slit. The words were delivered not with a shout, but with a chilling, factual precision that made them more devastating than any roar of rage. The attack on your pack was not an act of random aggression. It was justice, long delayed and brutally exacted, for a betrayal that poisoned this land a generation ago. I did not kill your parents out of malice. I executed them for their crimes. The world tilted. Elara's breath hitched, her mind scrambling for purchase. It was a lie. It had to be a lie, a vicious story crafted to torment her. But the conviction in his voice, the absolute, unshakable certainty in his eyes, struck a chord of dreadful doubt deep within her soul. The foundation of her entire life, the love and respect she had held for her parents, shuddered under the impact of his truth. She stared at him, her hatred faltering, replaced by a terrifying, hollow emptiness. The monster she had vowed to destroy had just handed her a mirror, and in its reflection, she saw the ghastly possibility that her entire world had been built upon a grave. The truth, or the brutal version of it Kael had delivered, did not bring clarity. Instead, it cast a long, disorienting shadow over everything Elara thought she knew. The furious energy that had sustained her through the initial weeks of her captivity evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a person. She moved through the opulent chambers like a ghost, the memories of her parents, now tainted with a sickening uncertainty. Was her father's strong embrace the same that had ordered the murder of a pleading woman? Was her mother's gentle laughter a sound that could coexist with such a dark secret? The questions were a constant, gnawing torment in her mind, more painful than any outright hatred. A fragile and unspoken truce settled within the four walls of the room. The tense silence was no longer a battleground, but a shared space of mutual, bewildering grief. Kael began to spend his evenings there, not as a jailer overseeing his prisoner, but as a man inhabiting his own space. He would tend to the fire, the flickering light carving the sharp planes of his face into something thoughtful, almost pensive. He would read from one of the many books on the shelves, or work quietly at his desk, his presence a constant, low hum in the background of her existence. He did not force conversation, but he no longer avoided her gaze. When their eyes met, she saw the same weight of history she felt crushing her own spirit. It was during one of these quiet evenings that she found her voice again. Not sharp with accusation, but soft with a hesitant need to understand. You said they were traveling under a banner of truce. She was curled in the chair opposite his, her voice barely above a whisper. How can you be sure? Kael looked up from the papers on his desk, his expression unguarded for a moment, revealing a profound weariness. Because my uncle was with them, he replied, his tone flat, as if reciting a grim fact he had long since memorized. He was a boy of 14, sent as a page to learn the art of diplomacy. They spared him, not out of mercy, but so he could return to our pack and deliver the message that the Greyfang Alpha showed no honor to those who sought it. He described the green and silver banner, torn and trampled into the mud. He described the exact location, a place called the Serpent's Pass, which your father had personally suggested for the meeting. Another piece of the puzzle slid into place with a dreadful click. Elara knew the Serpent's Pass. Her father had always spoken of it with a strange, somber respect, calling it a place of great consequence. She had thought he meant a great battle. Now she wondered. She began to ask more questions, each one a delicate probe into the wound of their shared past. He answered with that same blunt honesty, providing names, dates, and details that had the chilling ring of truth. There was no pleasure in his recounting, only a grim satisfaction that the record was, finally, being set straight. Slowly, against her will, her perception of him began to fracture and reform. She started to observe him, not just as Kael, her parents' killer, but as Kael, the alpha of the Bloodmoon Pack. She saw the way his betas spoke to him, with a deference that was earned, not fearfully given. She overheard him settling a dispute between two pack members from the other side of the door, his judgments fair, his patience evident, even when his authority was tested. The monster of her nightmares was slowly being replaced by the image of a leader, a man who carried the burden of his people with a solemn and heavy responsibility. The hatred that had been her anchor was dissolving, leaving her adrift in a sea of confusing empathy. She was beginning to see the man he was, a man shaped by a loss that mirrored her own. And the terrifying realization dawned that the line between victim and villain was not just blurred, but perhaps had never existed at all. The fragile understanding growing between them was shattered by the arrival of an enemy from within. The pack, a living entity with its own moods and tensions, had been a distant murmur beyond the chamber door, but now its discontent found a voice. That voice belonged to Gideon, a hulking, scarred warrior whose loyalty to Kael was forged in battle, but tempered by a rigid, unforgiving nature. He saw Elara not as a confused young woman entangled in old war, but as a venomous remnant of a hated bloodline, a living insult to his fallen comrades. His presence was a storm cloud. Whenever he entered the room, his eyes, the color of flint, fixed on her with undisguised loathing. He made a point of delivering her meals on the days he was assigned guard duty, his silence more threatening than any curse. One evening, as Kael was away attending to a border patrol report, Gideon entered without the customary knock. The air grew cold with his presence. He stood over her where she sat by the fire, his massive frame blocking the warmth. He grows soft, Gideon stated, his voice a low growl. Keeping you here, feeding you, treating you like a guest. It dishonors the memory of every blood moon wolf your butchered family sent to the earth. Elara kept her gaze fixed on the flames, her heart hammering against her ribs. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. Kael understands the past in a way you clearly do not, she replied, her voice thankfully steady. Gideon let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. He understands a pretty face and a tragic story. I understand the scent of treachery. It clings to you, Greyfang, and it will be the death of you. The threat hung in the air long after he left, a poison that seeped into the stones of the chamber. The following day, under the pretense of inspecting the room for security, Gideon and two of his loyalists lingered. As one of them deliberately knocked over a carafe of water, spilling it near the hearth, Gideon used the distraction to move behind her. His hand, rough and calloused, closed around her upper arm with bruising force. Perhaps if you were to disappear, he whispered, his breath hot and foul against her ear, our alpha would remember his true purpose. In that moment of pure primal terror, the door burst open. Kael stood there, having returned early. He did not shout. He did not roar. The silence that emanated from him was more terrifying than any sound. His eyes went from Gideon's hand on her arm to the warrior's face, and in that single, scorching glance, Elara saw a promise of utter annihilation. What happened next was a blur of controlled, brutal violence. Kael moved with the speed of a striking serpent. He did not shift, but his human form held all the power of his wolf. He crossed the room into strides, his fist connecting with Gideon's jaw with a sickening crack. As the larger man stumbled back, Kael followed, his attacks precise and merciless. He was not fighting an opponent. He was dismantling a challenge to his authority, and more importantly, a threat to what was his. When Gideon lay groaning on the floor, Kael stood over him, his chest heaving, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that filled the entire room. She is under my protection. To touch her is to challenge me. The next one who tries will not walk away. Is that understood? The message was not just for Gideon, but for every wolf in the stronghold. Her safety was now inextricably linked to his absolute power. In the aftermath, as the stunned warriors dragged a bleeding Gideon away, Elara stood trembling, the adrenaline slowly receding. Kael turned to her, his knuckles bloodied, his expression still dark with fury. But when his eyes met hers, the rage softened into something else, something fierce and possessive. He had not defended a political decision. He had defended her. The line between captive and protected had not just been blurred, it had been irrevocably erased. And in its place stood a bond forged in the fire of a shared enemy, a bond that felt terrifyingly, undeniably real. The air in the chamber was different after Gideon's challenge. A silent pact had been sealed in the currency of violence and protection. The lock on the door, Elara noticed the next morning, now remained unbolted during the day, a tangible symbol of a trust that had grown from the most poisoned soil. Kael's defense of her had not been an act of political necessity. It had been primal, personal. That knowledge hung between them, a charged and unspoken truth that transformed their every interaction. The careful distance they had maintained evaporated. He no longer occupied only the far side of the room. He would sit in the chair opposite hers, the firelight playing across his features, and the silence they shared was no longer filled with hostility, but with a heavy, contemplative weight. It began with small confessions, whispered into the space between them as the nights grew longer. Elara spoke first, her voice hesitant, of a memory she had not allowed herself to recall since her capture. She described the immense loneliness of being an alpha's only heir, the constant pressure to be strong, to be perfect, to never show a moment of weakness. She told him of a secret clearing deep in the Nightfang woods where she would go as a child to escape the watchful eyes of the pack, a place where she could simply be a girl and not a symbol. Kael listened, his gaze fixed on her, and when she finished, he did not offer pity. Instead, he shared a memory of his own. He spoke of the relentless training his father had imposed, of how a boy's tears were seen as a failure of leadership. He described the hollow, echoing silence of the alpha's quarters after his parents were killed, a silence he was forced to fill with his own presence long before he was ready. They were not stories of war, but stories of the children they had been, shaped by legacies they did not choose, their lives distorted by the same long shadow cast by their father's conflict. This sharing of fractured histories became a nightly ritual. They spoke of small joys and profound losses, each revelation a thread weaving their separate sorrows into a single, shared tapestry. Elara found herself telling him about her mother's laugh, a sound like ringing bells, and how it had slowly quieted in the years before the attack. Kael confessed that the only thing he truly remembered of his mother was the scent of the specific herbs she used in her tea, a scent he had spent years trying to find again. In these moments, the titles of Alpha and Captive, of Nightfang and Bloodmoon, fell away. They were simply Kael and Elara, two souls scarred by the same war, finding impossible solace in the one person who could truly understand the depth of their loss. The empathy she felt for him was no longer reluctant. It was a deep, aching recognition. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm lashed against the high window, they stood together before the fire. The conversation had lapsed into a comfortable quiet, the kind that exists only between two people who no longer need words to fill the space. Elara was looking into the flames, feeling the warmth of him beside her, a solid and reassuring presence. She felt his gaze on her and turned. The raw, unguarded intensity in his eyes was not that of a conqueror, but of a man seeing the entirety of a person for the first time. He raised a hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited the tension that had been building for weeks. It was not an act of conquest, but a question. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in anticipation. She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to rest over his, her answer given without a single word. What followed was a surrender, not of one to the other, but of both to the overwhelming force that had been pulling them together from the moment he carried her away from the ashes. It was a desperate, passionate collision of two broken worlds, a frantic and tender seeking of solace and connection in the warm, dark space they had carved out from the ruins of their past. In that union, the last vestiges of the stolen daughter and the rival Alpha dissolved, leaving only the profound, terrifying, and beautiful truth of what they had become to each other. The fragile world they had built within the stone walls of his chamber could not hold back the tides of the real one. Their newfound connection, profound and private, was a spark in a room full of kindling. Gideon, though physically healed, festered with a bitterness that poisoned the ranks. He wore his demotion like a badge of honor, whispering in the ears of those who were loyal to the old ways, to the clear-cut hatred of an enemy they could all recognize. He spoke of Kael's dangerous obsession, of a weakness that would inevitably lead to their pack's downfall. The ghost of Elara's bloodline, he argued, would be the death of them all. The tension within the Bloodmoon Pack became a palpable force, a storm gathering just beyond their door. The confrontation came not in a shadowy ambush, but in the full light of the Great Hall. Gideon, backed by a solid contingent of his supporters, publicly challenged Kael's leadership before the entire assembled pack. His accusations were not of strength or strategy, but of loyalty. He pointed a trembling finger at Elara, who stood silently at Kael's side, a place she had only recently begun to occupy. He asks us to embrace the viper whose fangs killed our fathers. Gideon roared, his voice echoing off the stone. He places the daughter of our greatest enemy at his right hand, and expects us to kneel. I will not follow an alpha who has forgotten the scent of Greyfang treachery. All eyes turned to Elara. This was the moment she had dreaded, and somehow known was inevitable. She could not remain silent. She could not let Kael fight this battle alone. She stepped forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, carrying across the silent hall. You are right to speak of my bloodline, she began, her gaze sweeping over the hostile faces. For too long, I believed the story I was told. I believed my parents were noble, their deaths a tragedy. But I have been forced to stare into the eyes of a different truth. She turned to look at Kael, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. A truth of ambush and murder, of a banner of truce trampled into the mud. My father, your Alpha's father, they were both victims of a cycle they could not break. I stand here not as a Greyfang seeking to reclaim what was lost. I stand here as Elara, choosing to end the war that orphaned both your Alpha and myself. Her words were a public reckoning, a final, painful severing from the past. She was no longer a victim of her history, but the architect of her future. Kael moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, a united front. The past is a grave, he declared, his voice resonating with absolute authority. We can either lie down in it, or we can build a new future upon it. Elara has chosen to build. She has shown more courage in facing the ghosts of her name than any of you who cling to your hollow hatred. My claim on her is no longer about conquest. It is a bond. He looked at Gideon, his expression final and unforgiving. The challenge is made. But know this, the winner of this fight does not just lead this pack, he defines it. Will we be a pack forever chained to the grievances of the dead, or will we be a pack strong enough to forge a new legacy? The fight that followed was brutal and swift. It was not like the battle where he had killed her parents. This was a contest of dominance, a raw display of power meant to cement his authority and protect their union. When it was over, and Gideon lay defeated and exiled, a new silence fell over the Bloodmoon Pack. It was not a silence of resentment, but one of awe and acceptance. Kael, breathing heavily, his body marked with the evidence of his victory, turned and extended a hand to Elara. She took it without hesitation, her fingers lacing with his. Together, they turned to face the pack. Their victory was not merely won by tooth and claw in the dirt of the Great Hall. It was won in the quiet confessions before a fire, in the shared burden of grief, in the choice to love where they were supposed to hate. They stood as partners, Alpha and Luna, having traversed the deepest valleys of hatred and betrayal to reach a peace they had stolen for themselves. The long war was finally over, and a new dawn, fragile and bright, began to break over the mountains. The end.